All right, good morning, everybody. I want to call this video How I Became a Liberal. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm still a Republican, I'm still a supporter of President Trump. I still strongly oppose Mr. Biden, the illegal occupier of the White House. But I came over the years to switch over from really hardline, right wing, perhaps fascistic style level of conservatism to American conservatism, which is actually classical liberalism. And that is really the difference here. And I think that's a lot of the difference in the misunderstanding that so many people who identify with the left, who are actually liberal and not leftist, but they mistake what the American right is actually all about, and that's why they wind up voting for racists like Joe Biden, who literally would not let Kamala Harris get on the bus. According to Kamala Harris, she was like, "I am that girl." Joe Biden is an old racist segregationist, and his choice of Kamala Harris as vice president was tokenism. It wasn't because of the content of her character, but rather the very thing that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King warned us not to engage in. He judged her merely by the color of her skin, as because she's not even like African American, she's half Indian and like a quarter Irish and a quarter Jamaican, and somehow that makes her black because of the Democrats have something called the one drop rule, which is part of the history of the racist Democrat Party, the KKK. You know, Jim Crow. He talks about Jim Crow and Jim Eagle as if like an eagle is like a bigger crow, or. But if anybody knows about Jim Crow, it's Joe Biden, who literally grew up politically at the feet of segregationists, of Klansmen, and the party's never flipped. That's a piece of truth that has to be repeated time and time again. And people say, well, what about the Southern strategy? Well, the Southern strategy was not about racism. It's about other aspects of Southern ideology that are not racist. And for the most part, today's South is much less racist than it was in the past when they were Democrats. And the truth is, the North is much more racist than it ever was. The flip happened not between the parties. The Republicans are still the party of Lincoln, and the Democrats are still the party of racial essentialism. And they use this term of anti-racism to cover up their racism, when anti-racism is racism, the so-called anti-racism, the self-proclaimed anti-racism. And then the irony is, when President Trump would always say, I'm the least racist person, so the anti-racists will say, well, that's the proof that he's a racist. So then how is it not proof that they're racist when they call themselves anti-racist, right? I mean, their support for Planned Parenthood, with the emphasis on the hood, except that Planned Parenthood, it's not fair to make a comparison, because Planned Parenthood killed 1,000 times more blacks than the Klan ever did, when it was really an actual functioning organization, as opposed to now a bunch of cosplayers that wouldn't even fill up a phone booth if you got them all together. The real Klan is groups like BLM, people who push CRT and things like that. That is the spiritual successor of Jim Crow, of the Klan, of all these things, because they continue the ideology of racial essentialism, as opposed to the Republican liberal ideology that's authentically liberal, that'll basically say that skin color doesn't matter any more than eye color or hair color. The self-proclaimed anti-racists on the left will say, well, that is racist to be colorblind is racist. What? Do you even hear the words that come out of your mouth? How ridiculous that is? That's not to say, again, that people can't on their own decide through what the Constitution calls the freedom of association, decide to identify with particular communities, perhaps based on race, but that's a decision that people make on their own and is not imposed by other people. And that's the major difference, meaning even the Nation of Islam, even the ideology of Farrakhan and the pre-Hajj Malcolm X and so forth, which are racist and really are the ideology of CRT. There is room for something so despicable and disgusting and ugly in this country if it is something that is decided by oneself as opposed to decided by an outside character. The same way our community, the Hasidic community, we have perhaps what a lot of people call a self-imposed ghetto. But again, that is our decision. Nobody else is forcing that upon us. And so too, if certain people want to identify with certain approaches to African American communities in a similar fashion, that's their choice and not the government's choice, not the education system's choice, and so forth. And so that's why I say I'm a liberal, because what I mean by liberal is you want to do that, you want to decide that on your own, you want to have that self-determination to do that on your own. You're not hurting anybody else by doing that. Go ahead, like we say in Yiddish, gesundheit. Be healthy and well and do your thing. Like the Christians say, live and let live. You do your thing, I do my thing. Or, recently in Israel, Chaim Cohen is the deputy mayor of Jerusalem, and he's a big Shasnik. Shas is a political party in Israel that is more or less along the Haredi lines in the Sephardic community. It was the great spiritual leader, of course, in the past was Chacham Ovadia Yosef, who was the Gadol Hador. And there was an article recently where this deputy mayor Cohen was discussed a conversation that he had a number of years ago with Rav Elyashiv, Zeichet Tzaddik Livrocha. And they were discussing this question of separation of, for lack of a better term, synagogue and state in Israel. And now, I'm an American, it's none of my business what the Israelis do. Just because I happen to be of the Jewish religion, it's really none of my business what the Israeli government does. That's not only a more or less anti-Zionist Satmar approach. Rabbi J.B. Soloveitchik, Zeichet Tzaddik Livrocha, from Yeshiva University, one of the leaders of religious Zionism in America in his day, and still regarded as the spiritual guide point for the modern Orthodox and religious Zionist world in America, in many ways, expressed himself often that Jews in America really have no business voicing an opinion in Israeli politics. And I agree with that in an ideal, but I'm using this example to demonstrate how the American ideal can be used in other countries to make things better. So right now, the discussion is apparently because, I'm not really following Israeli politics that closely, but apparently a lot of the Haredi, what they call themselves Haredi community in Israel, I don't really consider them true Haredim because they they're involved in the Israeli government, and if it's kind of like a no true Scotsman type of argument there. But nonetheless, those that call themselves ultra orthodox in Israel that do engage with the Israeli government are discussing now, and this was the discussion that Deputy Mayor Cohen had with Rav Elyashiv, that essentially there would have to come a time when there would be this Jeffersonian separation of synagogue and state in Israel. And I think that's great. I mean, we manage in America not to marry Reform converts, right, without the government doing our religion for us. And so, too, the same thing. There's no need in Israel for the Rabbanut on two sides. One side, the Haredim don't even care about the Rabbanut. They don't listen to the Rabbanut. And so you really only have a small portion of the society, which are basically a certain sector of the Dati Leumi, the religious nationalists, the more or less modern Orthodox world in Israel that really even cares about what the Rabbanut says. And it's really only the right-wing faction of that, because Rabbanut, meaning the government so-called chief rabbinate of Israel, and a lot of the more mainstream modern Orthodox think that they're too Haredi because whatever, Rabbi Lau wears a black hat or something, so that makes him Haredi, or I don't know. Like all the chief rabbis wear black hats. Rabbi Cook wore a spudik, So I don't get what the whole big deal is, but anyway, there's really nobody who really, maybe like 5% of the Israeli population really gives a damn what the Rabbanut has to say. You'll pardon my Ivrit, but on the other hand, they have tremendous power in Israel. You can't get married, you can't get buried, you can't get divorced, you can't do anything without the Rabbanut, without the so-called chief rabbinate. So what's that all about? That's not really democratic, right? That's not even Republican. The thing is that the only way that they could really accomplish this, though, and be successful, is if they take the authentic Jeffersonian approach. Meaning not that you replace the Rabbanut with something else, but you disestablish religion in the country. And if that's the case, well then, like it or not, Judaism is a religion. I know a lot of people who identify as Jews don't like that, but it's true. And if you don't have a chief rabbinate, you really shouldn't be calling yourself a Jewish state. It might be a state of Jews, might be a Jewish majority country, the way that we talk about Muslim majority countries. And so, yes, you might still have, just like how in America, because it's a Christian majority country, that Christmas is a national holiday. You want to have, out of respect for the majority of the citizens, Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah and maybe all the Yom Tovim as national holidays, in the way that Sunday is the day when most post offices are closed, except I think there was one or two places in California where it was, and maybe somewhere in Tennessee or something, where it was Saturday. And I don't know why, the town of Palm Tree still doesn't have a post office, likely because they think that they have to be open on Saturday and closed on Sunday, which they probably could. So they still use the Monroe post office, while we in the town of Bethel have like 7 post offices. So that's the world that we live in. So you want to have that, because I think it was Dov Fisher, it was someone else was writing about this, and saying, well, in America still we have the Jeffersonian freedom of religion. The whole idea of Christmas being a national holiday is really quite late in American history. It's not, I think it was like Ulysses S. Grant, maybe, who or it was President Garfield. It was somewhere. It was post-Civil War where we got Christmas to be a national holiday, because really a lot of the early colonists didn't even celebrate Christmas. It wasn't on their liturgical calendar, and if it was, it really wasn't that big of a deal the way that it became in America in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and also to a certain extent in England, because of Charles Dickens, really, more than anything else. So all of this, it's a lot to talk about, but in any event, the point that I'm saying, why am I bringing this up? I'm saying that when I was a kid and I looked at Israel and I was a Zionist, I was America Hana guy. I was like, we got to pretty much have a religious government, and we'll make a Sanhedrin, and that's how we'll bring Mashiach. That's what I believed back when I was a kid. But then I grew up, and that's why I don't know how to say in English. Guys like these Frische Bali Chiva, all right, the Frische Kanoim, like Rabar and Satmar Rebbe and Monroe talks about, who think they know everything because they just read a book by Rebbe Victor Miller, Zechus Yigan Leinu, who understood in real life that not all of his ideals necessarily translate to real life. I'll give you an example, because my Rosh Hashiva was the president of the shul by Rebbe Victor Miller in Young Israel of Rugby. And he once overheard, there was someone came to, and even in those days, Rabbi Miller was fire and brimstone against television and everything, things that were unheard of. In the 50s and 60s, you're going to talk against television? Like, what? But that he was a purist in that sense, right? So, against television, against movies, against all those things, right? Although he did say, interestingly, that the television was invented so Lubavitcher Rebbe could put his Farbrengens on the internet, on the television. He was, from all the Litvaks, the most pro-Lubavitch, and I'm not pro-Lubavitch, but he saw the Milas also. Anyway, even being a purist, he understood the good that was things that are not perfect. Like they say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, right? So, and there's a lot of good in Lubavitch, even though obviously it's not perfect, and it's far from perfect. But in any event, what am I saying here? What am I talking about here? I have something else in my mind I'm not going to say. This story with Rabbi Miller that Meir Shiva said. He said that there was someone that had shalom bias issues, and Rabbi Miller, who was so against television, so against movies, everything, he told this guy, you should go take your wife to the movies. Because he understood, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And there's a time and a place for everything. Maybe I go overboard with that stuff, right? But don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I think that's part of what I mean by liberalism. By being able to be flexible and understand when there's a time and a place for everything, and everything in its time and in its place. And so you cannot be imposing, because how are you going to make a Jewish state in this day and age without a Sanhedrin? Well, you make the Sanhedrin. Would it nobody care? Nobody wants to listen to the Sanhedrin. What authority is it going to have? Because they tried to make a few times the Sanhedrin. I think they have another one. that's been around for like 20 years now, right? And, you know, they tried to make it, and it didn't work. And so, you know, you cannot be imposing, because how are you going to make a Jewish state in this day and age without a Sanhedrin? Well, you make the Sanhedrin. Would nobody care? Nobody wants to listen to the Sanhedrin. What authority is it going to have? Because they tried to make a few times the Sanhedrin. I think they have another one that's been around for like 20 years now, right? And basically nobody holds from it, right? It doesn't mean anything except for the people who are members of it are the only ones who believe in it, right? So what are you going to have? Even Rabbi Kook was smart enough to realize, all right, he's the Ashkenazi chief rabbi, but there's already been a Rishon LeZion for 80 years, right, before he started the Rabbanut, so there'll be a Sephardic chief rabbi, Ashkenazi chief rabbi, because he recognized Mashiach's not here yet, right? So, but still, taking this British idea of having a chief rabbi as opposed to the American idea of liberty, it's a big mistake. This was the same Rabbi Kook, by the way. Whenever I talk about Jeffersonianism, and then a religious Zionist will say, but Jefferson owned slaves. I was like, yeah, and Rabbi Kook opposed women's suffrage. So everybody's in their time and in their place. I don't think any of you would believe that if Jefferson was alive today, he would go out of his way to go get some slaves. And I don't think and similarly, nobody believes that if Rabbi Kook was alive today, he'd be fighting against women voting. I used to hear this rumor when I was more modern that in Satmar the women don't vote or something like that, which is nonsense. The women are the ones who run the Board of Elections in Curious Joel. All the women vote. Maybe in Square they don't vote. I don't know. I'm sure they vote in Square too, because they recognize that the voting is important, so you need the votes, right? So why wouldn't you have women vote? Everybody's got to vote, right? The only people who don't vote are the Neturei Karta, extremist, because they say that the Kruler Rav Shaul Brach, that he said that we shouldn't vote even in Chutzos, meaning in Israel we don't vote, the Satmar don't vote, right? But in America, the mainstream Satmar, they all vote. But there are extremists who hold that even in America they shouldn't vote, that we should be makabel to all Hagolas, but that's a little bit extreme, more than a little bit. And it's dangerous too, because look what we got now. People are dying in Afghanistan, and if a few people, the quote-unquote never-Trumpers, instead of caring about the mean tweets, now they have blood on their hands. I wouldn't even just say anybody who voted for Biden has blood on their hands. Anyone who didn't vote for President Trump has blood on their hands, but certainly those people who put the false ballots in. We know clearly, you see these pristine, clean ballots, no folds, no nothing, dumped in the middle of the night, didn't even have time to vote down ballot because we're so sloppy in their fraud. And yet if you say it, you're going to be banned from YouTube and this and that, because it's the truth. Why do they want to why did the guy who made Earthworm Jim get banned from YouTube? Because he's telling the truth, right? But this is what I mean about liberalism. This is the best way to really express it, And Mel Brooks, he had that, what do you call it? The 2 million year old man, or something, 2,000-year-old man. And Carl Reiner, who blocked me on Twitter before he died, a couple years before he died. So Carl Reiner asked Mel Brooks, back in the days, did you have national anthems? And he said, well, we had cave anthems. He said, I remember my cave anthem. Let them all go to hell except Cave 76. And again, excuse my Ivrit, but the same thing in Israel. If the Chilonim want to go to hell, we don't have to shove religion down their throat. It's not our job to force them to marry Jewish, to eat kosher, to do all these other things. They can do their thing. If they want to do what they want, let them all go to hell. We're going to do our thing, and we live in a free country, We don't live in Russia. Even today in Russia, the Jehovah's Witnesses get locked up just for their religion. And then you're going to say, well, that's because Putin, he's a right-winger. Well, what about in communist China? That's a left-wing country where they lock you up for being Muslim and do worse than lock you up. And all these people are talking about Islamophobia, this and that, blah, 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 blah. And do they care about the Uyghurs? And what I understand is even like Muslims in Saudi Arabia don't care about the Uyghurs. Why do you care about the Uyghurs? There's a Holocaust going on against Muslims in China. But why? Because they're Chinese Muslims. They don't count as much as Arab Muslims, which there is part of that in Islam, that, if you're from the family of the Prophet, that you're on somewhat of a higher level, as much as they want to claim that there's total equality amongst the Ummah. We know that that's not really true, meaning even to the point where we had a nutritionist that we had to work with years ago, and she was Muslim, and she was I think Albanian, some kind of European Muslim, and she said in her mosque they couldn't find an Albanian imam, so they have an Arab imam, and he kind of like disrespects his whole kahila, his whole congregation there. Do they say kahila in Arabic? I don't know. Like, they have all of our other words. They daven Maghrib, right?